The morning sun cast long shadows across San Francisco International Airport's Terminal 3 as Mrs. Lee made her way through the bustling crowd. At 68, she moved with the quiet grace of someone who had spent decades navigating these halls, though not a soul would have guessed she owned the very airline whose counter she was approaching. Her silver hair was neatly tied back in a simple bun, and she wore a well-loved blue cardigan over comfortable traveling clothes. The worn leather handbag hanging from her shoulder had been with her for 20 years, a reminder of her early days when she was just starting to build Pacific Airways from nothing but a dream and determination. As she waited in line at the check-in counter, Mrs. Lee observed everything around her with keen eyes. A young mother struggled with a crying baby while trying to manage her luggage. Without hesitation, Mrs. Lee stepped forward to help, holding the baby's carrier while the grateful mother sorted out her documents. This was who she was, always ready to lend a hand, regardless of her status. The story of how she came to own Pacific Airways was remarkable, though few knew it. She had arrived in America 4 decades ago, with just $200 in her pocket and a fierce determination to succeed. Starting as a cleaning staff at this very airport, she worked extra shifts, saved every penny, and studied business at night. Her coworkers had often found her reading finance books during lunch breaks, dreaming of the day she would run her own airline. Through smart investments and an uncanny ability to spot opportunities, Mrs. Lee gradually built her empire. But success hadn't changed her fundamental belief that true leadership meant understanding every aspect of your business from the ground up. That's why she regularly flew economy class on her own airline, booking tickets under her lesser-known first name, keeping her identity hidden from most staff. Today was one of those mystery shopping days, as she liked to call them. She had specifically chosen the morning flight to New York, known for being particularly busy and challenging for the crew. Standing in the economy line, she watched as first-class passengers breezed past, some casting curious glances at the elderly woman who seemed out of place in her simple clothes. A group of businessmen rushed past, nearly knocking her off balance. Mrs. Lee steadied herself, smiling slightly as she remembered being just like them once. Always in a hurry, always rushing to the next big deal. Now she knew better. Success wasn't just about speed. It was about paying attention to the small details, about treating people with dignity regardless of their appearance or status. As the line slowly moved forward, she quietly observed the gate agents and flight crew. Some were handling the morning rush with professional grace, while others showed signs of stress. She made mental notes in her small notepad, not to punish, but to understand where her airline could improve, where additional training might be needed, where processes could be streamlined to make both passengers and employees' lives easier. Little did anyone know that the simple-looking elderly woman in comfortable walking shoes was carrying in her worn handbag documents for a billion-dollar deal she would be closing in New York. Mrs. Lee believed that blending in was the best way to truly understand her customers' experiences. After all, she had built Pacific Airways on one fundamental principle. Every passenger deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their ticket class or appearance. As she approached the boarding gate, Mrs. Lee took a deep breath, preparing herself for another undercover journey on her own airline. These mystery flights had helped her maintain the airline's high standards over the years, though sometimes they revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature and prejudice. Today it would prove to be one of those eye-opening experiences, though she didn't know it yet. The boarding process was in full swing as Mrs. Lee waited patiently in line, her carry-on bag resting beside her sensible shoes. The morning rush had brought its usual chaos. Passengers struggling with oversized bags, children clinging to parents' legs, and the constant beeping of boarding passes being scanned. As she approached the entrance to the aircraft, Mrs. Lee noticed her carry-on seemed heavier than usual. She had packed light as always, but the morning arthritis in her hands was making everything feel more challenging. The flight attendant at the door, Ms. Chen, was busy checking her phone, barely glancing up as passengers filed past her. "Excuse me," Mrs. Lee said softly, Would you mind helping me with my bag? My hands aren't working as well as they used to this morning. She offered a warm smile, the kind that usually put people at ease. Miss Chen looked up from her phone, annoyance flickering across her face. Seriously? She muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Turning to her colleague, she rolled her eyes dramatically. Another one who can't handle their own luggage. Why do they even travel if they can't manage? The cruel words hung in the air as several passengers turned to watch. An uncomfortable silence fell over the immediate area, broken only by the continued beeping of the scanner. Mrs. Li stood there, her smile fading but her dignity intact as other passengers shifted uncomfortably. A kind-looking businessman behind Mrs. Li stepped forward. I'd be happy to help, he offered, reaching for her bag. But Ms. Chen suddenly grabbed the handle, yanking it roughly. Fine, I'll do it. That's apparently what we're here for now. Personal gullhops for people who don't plan ahead. She heaved the bag into the overhead compartment with unnecessary force, nearly knocking down a smaller bag in the process. Mrs. Li quietly took her seat in 14C, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She couldn't help but remember her own days working at the airport. How she had learned early on that kindness cost nothing but meant everything. Back then, she had cleaned floors and emptied trash bins, but she had always done it with pride and respect for everyone around her. A young mother across the aisle leaned over. Are you okay? She whispered. That was terribly rude of her. Her sleeping baby was cradled in her arms, peaceful despite the surrounding tension. I'm fine, dear, Mrs. Li assured her with a gentle smile. Sometimes people forget that everyone has a story, everyone has their struggles. She pulled out her small notepad, recording the incident not with anger, but with thoughtful consideration about how this could become a teaching moment. Meanwhile, Ms. Chen continued her performance at the front of the cabin, making exaggerated gestures to her colleague about entitled passengers and impossible demands. She was unaware that Mr. Park, the airline's head of customer service, was sitting in 12A, watching everything with growing concern. He had recognized Mrs. Li immediately but maintained his silence, knowing she preferred to handle these situations in her own way. As more passengers boarded, Mrs. Li observed how Ms. Chen's attitude varied depending on how well-dressed or young the passengers appeared. She was all smiles for a group of young professionals in business attire, but barely acknowledged an elderly couple who needed help with their bags. Mrs. Li pulled out her worn leather agenda and began writing, not complaints, but ideas. Ideas about training programs that could help staff understand the challenges of elderly travelers, about ways to foster empathy in customer service, about turning difficult moments into opportunities for growth. The plane's engines hummed to life as the last passengers settled in. Mrs. Li closed her eyes briefly, remembering how she had started her business with just one small regional plane and a dream of creating an airline where every passenger would feel valued. Today's experience was disappointing, but in her heart, she knew it was also an opportunity to make her airline even better, to help someone learn and grow, to turn an uncomfortable moment into lasting positive change. The flight had been airborne for about an hour when Mrs. Li began to feel the chill of the cabin air conditioning. She wasn't alone. Several passengers were pulling on light jackets or reaching for the air vents above their seats. The temperature seemed unusually low, even for an airplane cabin. Mrs. Li noticed the young mother across the aisle trying to wrap her baby in an extra blanket while shivering herself. Without hesitation, she pressed the call button, thinking she could request blankets for both of them. The button glowed steadily for several minutes before Ms. Chen appeared, her expression making it clear that answering the call was an unwelcome interruption. What is it now? Ms. Chen asked, not even attempting to hide her irritation. Her badge was slightly crooked, and her uniform jacket was unbuttoned, small details that Mrs. Li knew went against company policy. The cabin seems quite cold, Mrs. Li explained politely. Would it be possible to get a blanket? Perhaps one for this young mother as well? She gestured toward the woman with the baby. Ms. Chen let out an exaggerated sigh. You should have brought your own if you get cold easily. Besides, blankets are only for business class on this flight. She turned to leave, then added over her shoulder, maybe next time, book a proper ticket if you want extras. The young mother looked embarrassed. Please, don't worry about us, she whispered to Mrs. Lee. We'll be okay. But something remarkable began to happen. A gentleman in the row behind stood up and offered his jacket to the young mother. An older couple across the aisle rummaged in their carry-on and produced a soft travel blanket for Mrs. Lee. A college student pulled out a cozy sweater from her backpack and insisted Mrs. Lee take it. My grandmother always tells me to pack an extra layer, the student said with a warm smile. She'd never forgive me if I didn't help. Mrs. Lee was touched by the kindness of her fellow passengers, even as she noticed Mr. Park in row 12 typing rapidly on his tablet, no doubt documenting the ongoing situation. The contrast between Ms. Chen's behavior and the natural compassion of the passengers was striking. When the drink service began, Ms. Chen's attitude didn't improve. She practically threw napkins at some passengers and skipped others entirely. When she reached Mrs. Lee's row, she didn't even stop the cart. Mrs. Lee called out gently, I haven't been offered a drink yet. Oh, did you want something? Ms. Chen's voice dripped with sarcasm. I thought maybe you brought your own drinks too, since you're so prepared for everything else. A few passengers gasped at her rudeness, while others looked away uncomfortably. A different flight attendant, Mrs. Wong, who had been working the other aisle, quickly came over. I'll help you, ma'am, she said kindly, shooting a disapproving look at Ms. Chen. What would you like to drink? As Mrs. Wong poured a cup of hot tea for Mrs. Lee, she apologized quietly. I'm so sorry about this. It's not how we usually treat our passengers. Mrs. Lee smiled warmly at Mrs. Wong. Thank you, dear. It's nice to see someone who understands what service truly means. She took a sip of her tea, remembering how she used to serve passengers herself in the early days of her airline. Back then, she had worked every position, from cleaning the cabins to serving drinks, believing that understanding each job was crucial to building a successful company. The rest of the meal service continued in much the same way, with Ms. Chen making snide comments just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. But something beautiful was happening in response. The passengers in Mrs. Lee's section had formed a kind of protective community. They shared snacks, exchanged stories, and helped each other with various small needs. Mrs. Lee took it all in, making notes in her small book. This flight was teaching her something valuable about human nature, how one person's unkindness could inspire others to be even more compassionate. She knew this experience would lead to important changes in her airline, but for now, she simply observed, documented, and appreciated the unexpected kindness of strangers. As the flight continued eastward, Mr. Park watched the unfolding situation with growing concern from his seat in 12A. His tablet was filled with detailed notes about Ms. Chen's behavior, but his greater interest was in observing how Mrs. Lee, his boss of 15 years, handled the situation with such remarkable grace. He remembered his first meeting with Mrs. Lee, back when he was just a junior customer service representative. She had been walking through the terminal, picking up scattered pieces of trash herself while explaining to him that no job was beneath anyone if it helped passengers have a better experience. That day had changed his entire perspective on customer service. Now, as he pretended to work on his laptop, he couldn't help but notice how Mrs. Lee was quietly turning this difficult situation into an opportunity to observe their airline's strengths and weaknesses. She had her small notebook open, jotting down notes with her distinctive, careful handwriting. Knowing her, these wouldn't just be complaints about Ms. Chen, but rather thoughtful observations about training opportunities and system improvements. The flight hit a patch of turbulence, causing the seat belt signs to illuminate with a gentle ding. Ms. Chen's voice came over the intercom, sounding annoyed rather than professional. Everyone needs to stay in their seats. And please don't use the call buttons unless it's a real emergency." As if to demonstrate her point, she ignored two lit call buttons in the middle section of the plane. Mr. Park watched as Mrs. Lee noted this too, her pen moving steadily across her notebook page. She wasn't just writing. She was sketching what looked like a new layout for the flight attendant station, perhaps thinking of ways to make it easier for staff to monitor and respond to passenger needs. A young boy across the aisle from Mrs. Lee started feeling airsick. His mother pressed the call button repeatedly, but Ms. Chen walked past without even glancing their way. Without hesitation, Mrs. Lee pulled a ginger candy from her worn handbag and offered it to the boy. "This helps with an upset stomach," she said kindly. "I always carry them when I fly." Mr. Park smiled, remembering how Mrs. Lee had insisted on stocking ginger candies in all their first-class lounges after experiencing motion sickness herself on a turbulent flight years ago. She believed that every passenger discomfort was an opportunity to improve their service. The kind flight attendant, Mrs. Wong, finally noticed the boy's distress and hurried over with a sickness bag and a cup of water. As she helped the young passenger, Mrs. Lee watched the interaction carefully, noting how Mrs. Wong's simple act of kindness immediately put both mother and child at ease. From his vantage point, Mr. Park could see other passengers watching these contrasting examples of service. Some were filming discreetly on their phones, while others were writing their own notes, presumably for complaint letters. What none of them knew was that the quiet elderly woman in 14C would read each of their complaints personally, just as she had done every week for the past 40 years. Mrs. Lee continued her careful documentation, pausing occasionally to help nearby passengers or share a kind word. She noted how the cabin crew worked together, or in Ms. Chen's case, didn't work together, and how this affected the overall flight experience. Her observations went beyond just logging bad behavior. She was analyzing patterns, thinking about solutions, considering how to turn this challenging situation into a teaching opportunity. As the flight progressed, Mr. Park noticed something remarkable. The passengers in Mrs. Lee's section had formed a sort of informal support network, sharing snacks, offering assistance, and watching out for each other's needs. It was exactly the kind of community spirit Mrs. Lee had always envisioned for her airline. Passengers feeling connected and cared for, even if it wasn't coming from the expected source. The sun was setting outside the airplane windows, casting a warm glow through the cabin. Mr. Park watched as Mrs. Lee closed her notebook and sat back in her seat, a slight smile on her face. He knew that smile well. It was the same one she wore when she had figured out how to turn a problem into an opportunity for growth. The plane touched down at JFK International Airport just as the evening lights were beginning to twinkle across New York City. As passengers began gathering their belongings, the cabin buzzed with quiet conversations about the unusual flight experience they'd shared. Mrs. Lee remained seated, patiently waiting as others rushed to exit. The kind young college student who had offered her sweater earlier stopped to return Mrs. Lee's small notebook, which had slipped under the seat. "I hope you'll report what happened today," she said softly. "No one should be treated that way, especially not someone's grandmother." Mrs. Lee thanked her with a warm smile, tucking the notebook into her worn leather handbag. She waited until most passengers had left before standing up, knowing from experience that there was no point in rushing. At the front of the cabin, Ms. Chen was already putting on her coat, clearly eager to end her shift. "Excuse me," Mrs. Lee said gently, approaching the flight attendant station. "I'd like to get a customer feedback form, please." Ms. Chen barely contained her eye roll. "Look, if you're going to complain about the blankets again, I already told you they're for business class only." "Actually," Mrs. Lee replied, her voice still kind but carrying a new note of authority, "I'd like to document today's entire flight experience." "Whatever." Ms. Chen snorted, roughly pulling a crumpled form from a drawer. "I doubt anyone will read it anyway. These things usually end up in the trash." The senior flight attendant, Mrs. Wong, who had been kind throughout the flight, overheard and hurry over. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. Please let me get you a proper form." She shot a disapproving look at Ms. Chen. "That won't be necessary," Mrs. Lee said calmly, reaching into her handbag. She pulled out a business card and her company ID badge, both bearing the Pacific Airways logo. "I think I have a pretty good understanding of where the feedback goes." The cabin fell silent. Ms. Chen's face went pale as she read the card. Mrs. Lee, founder and CEO, Pacific Airways. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Mrs. Wang's eyes widened in recognition, and she immediately bowed slightly. "Mrs. Lee, I had no idea you were on board today." Several remaining passengers who had witnessed the scene gasped. The young mother with the baby, who was still gathering her things nearby, covered her mouth in surprise. Mr. Park chose this moment to step forward from where he had been observing. "Good evening, Mrs. Lee," he said professionally, though his eyes twinkled. "I've documented everything as usual." Ms. Chen's hands began to shake. I didn't know. I never." "That's precisely the point, isn't it?" Mrs. Lee said quietly. "You didn't know who I was, so you felt it was acceptable to treat me, and other passengers, with disrespect. But tell me, when did kindness become reserved only for those we think are important?" The young mother stepped forward, still cradling her sleeping baby. "You're the owner of the airline, but you let her treat you that way all flight." Mrs. Lee smiled gently. "How else do I know what some more passengers experience? It's easy to get good service when people know who you are. The true test of character is how we treat those we think can't do anything for us." Ms. Chen's eyes filled with tears. Am I fired?" Mrs. Lee looked at her thoughtfully. "That depends. Are you ready to learn why I started this airline in the first place? Because it wasn't to make money. It was to show that business and kindness can go hand in hand." The remaining passengers watched in amazement as this small, elderly woman in her simple clothes commanded the entire cabin with just her quiet presence. Even the cleaning crew, who had just arrived to prepare the plane for its next flight, stopped to listen. "Report to my office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Mrs. Lee continued, her voice firm but not unkind. "Bring your notebook. You'll want to take notes. We have a lot to discuss about the true meaning of service." The next morning, the Pacific Airways headquarters buzzed with nervous energy. Word had spread quickly about the incident on yesterday's flight, and every employee who passed by Mrs. Lee's office couldn't help but glance at Ms. Chen, who sat rigidly in the waiting area, clutching a new notebook with trembling hands. At exactly 9 a.m., Mrs. Lee's office door opened. The space inside was surprisingly modest for a CEO. No elaborate decorations or expensive furniture, just simple, practical items and walls covered with photos of airline staff and thank you letters from passengers. "Come in," Mrs. Lee said warmly, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. "Would you like some tea?" Without waiting for an answer, she began preparing 2 cups of green tea, just as she had done every morning for the past 40 years. Ms. Chen sat down stiffly, her eyes fixed on her lap. "Mrs. Lee, I want to apologize." "Before you do," Mrs. Lee interrupted gently, "I'd like to show you something." She opened a worn photo album and turned it to face Ms. Chen. "Do you recognize this woman?" The photo showed a young woman in an airline uniform, standing proudly in front of a small propeller plane. Her face was streaked with grease, but she was beaming with pride. That's you?" Ms. Chen asked in disbelief. "Yes, 38 years ago. I wasn't just a flight attendant. I was also part of the ground crew, the cleaning team, and sometimes even helped with basic maintenance. We only had 2 planes back then, and everyone had to do everything." Mrs. Lee turned another page, revealing a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local airline denied loan. Banks question female owner's capability." They said I was too old, too female, too foreign to run an airline. Mrs. Lee continued, her voice steady. Every day, someone told me I didn't belong in this industry. But you know what kept me going? The passengers who showed me kindness when others showed contempt. Ms. Chen's eyes filled with tears as she recognized her own behavior reflected in the story. I never thought. No, we often don't think about other people's journeys. Mrs. Lee agreed. Let me tell you about Mr. Wu, a passenger who used to fly with us every week. He was elderly and needed extra help, but he always had a kind word for everyone. One day, he missed his usual flight. We later learned he had passed away, but his family told us that his last wishes included a thank you letter to our airline staff who had treated him with dignity in his final years. Mrs. Lee poured more tea as she continued. Every person who steps onto our planes carries their own story, their own struggles, their own dreams. That elderly passenger you dismissed, she might be a retired teacher who educated hundreds of children. That slower passenger you rushed, he might be recovering from chemotherapy, but choosing to live life fully. Ms. Chen wiped her eyes with a tissue. I was so focused on doing my job efficiently, I forgot about being human. Efficiency without compassion is like an airplane without wings. It might look good on the ground, but it will never truly serve its purpose, Mrs. Lee said softly. Now let me show you something else. She opened her laptop and played a video compilation of passenger testimonials. People whose lives had been touched by simple acts of kindness from Pacific Airways staff. A mother who had been helped with her twins during a difficult flight, an elderly man who had been treated with patience during a moment of confusion, a young student who had been comforted during her first flight alone. This is why I still fly economy class regularly, Mrs. Lee explained. Not to catch people doing wrong, but to understand what our passengers experience. Yesterday taught me that we need to do better in training our staff to see the human being behind every ticket. Ms. Chen straightened in her chair, finding her voice. Are you going to fire me? No, Mrs. Lee replied, surprising her. Instead, I'm going to give you a challenge. For the next month, you'll work alongside our ground crew, helping elderly passengers, assisting families with children, supporting people with special needs. You'll learn their stories, understand their challenges, and then, only then, will you return to flying. Hope flickered across Ms. Chen's face as she realized she was being offered not just a second chance, but an opportunity to grow. Thank you, Mrs. Lee. I promised I'll learn. I know you will, Mrs. Lee smiled, pulling out her well-worn notebook. Now let's talk about how we can use your experience to help other staff members understand the importance of treating every passenger with dignity, regardless of who they might be. 6 months had passed since that memorable flight, and Pacific Airways had undergone a remarkable transformation. The airline's training center was buzzing with activity as Ms. Chen stood before a group of new flight attendants, sharing her story with passionate honesty. I thought I knew everything about being a flight attendant, she told the attentive trainees. I could recite safety procedures in my sleep and serve drinks with perfect efficiency. But I had forgotten the most important part of our job, seeing the human being in every passenger. The training room walls now displayed photos of diverse passengers alongside their stories, a reminder that every person who stepped onto their planes carried their own unique journey. One of these photos showed the young mother and baby from that fateful flight, now regular customers who always spoke highly of the airline's improved service. In the back of the room, Mrs. Lee watched quietly, her heart full of pride. The incident had sparked a complete overhaul of the airline's training program. New modules focused on empathy, age sensitivity, and understanding different passenger needs. Every staff member, from pilots to ground crew, went through what they now called the dignity training. Ms. Chen had become the face of this new initiative. Her monthly coffee with crew sessions, where staff members shared their experiences and learned from each other, had become so popular that other airlines were beginning to adopt similar programs. Remember the elderly passenger who changed everything? Ms. Chen continued, not mentioning it was Mrs. Lee herself. That day taught me that kindness isn't a service upgrade. It's the foundation of everything we do. The airline's reputation had soared. Social media was filled with stories of exceptional service from Pacific Airways staff. One viral post showed a flight attendant sitting with an anxious child during turbulence, teaching her to make paper airplanes to calm her fears. Another captured a ground crew member who stayed 2 hours after his shift to help an elderly couple navigate a complicated connection. Mrs. Lee's original notebook from that flight had been framed and hung in the training center's entrance. Below it, a simple plaque read, "Every passenger has a story. Every interaction is an opportunity to make that story better." The changes weren't just about customer service. Pacific Airways had introduced new features specifically designed for elderly travelers. Priority boarding without extra fees, special assistance requests without complicated forms, and a travel buddy system where experienced passengers could volunteer to help those needing extra support. The young college student who had offered Mrs. Lee her sweater that day was now interning with the airline's customer experience team. Her first project: designing comfortable blankets that would be available to all passengers, regardless of their ticket class. During one training session, a new hire asked Ms. Chen if she ever regretted that difficult day. She smiled and shook her head. That day showed me that sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest learning. Mrs. Lee could have fired me, but instead, she taught me that true leadership is about lifting people up, not tearing them down. The airline industry had taken notice. Pacific Airways was now receiving awards not just for customer service, but for employee satisfaction as well. Other airlines sent their training teams to learn from their program, and Mrs. Lee was frequently invited to speak at industry conferences about transforming company culture. But perhaps the most meaningful change was visible in the small, everyday moments. The way staff members greeted elderly passengers with genuine warmth, how they celebrated birthdays of regular travelers with handmade cards, how they turned difficult situations into opportunities to show extra care. Mrs. Lee still flew economy regularly, though now she was harder to disguise. Too many staff members had her photo hanging in their crew areas as a reminder of the airline's values. But she didn't mind. Every time she boarded a flight, she saw her vision coming to life. An airline where every passenger, regardless of age or status, was treated with dignity and respect. As Ms. Chen concluded her training session, she shared one final thought with the new crew members. Remember, we're not just serving passengers, we're caring for someone's parent, someone's child, someone's loved one. And in treating them with kindness, we become part of their story.